Hello, guys, welcome to Psyched Minds. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share if you like. We are reading Veronica Decides to Die by Paulo Coelho, page number 93, from where we left off. Veronica didn't know if it was day or night. Dr. Igor had the light on, but then he did every morning. It was only when she reached the corridor and saw the moon that she realized she had slept far longer than she had thought. On the way to the ward, she noticed a framed photograph on the wall. It was of the main square in Jublajana. Before the statue of the poet Presseren had been put up, it showed couples strolling, probably on a Sunday. She looked at the date on the photograph, the summer of 1910. The summer of 1910. There were all those people whose children and grandchildren had already died, frozen in one particular moment of their lives. The women wore voluminous dresses, and the men were all wearing a hat, jacket, gaiters, tie, or that colored piece of cloth, as the insane call it, and carrying an umbrella under one arm. And how hot would it have been then? The temperature must have been what it would be today in summer, 95 degrees in the shade. If an Englishman turned up in clothing more suited to the heat, in Bermuda shorts and shirt sleeves, what would those people have thought? He must be crazy. She had understood perfectly what Dr. Igor meant, just as she understood that although she had always felt loved and protected, there had been one missing element that would have transformed that love into a blessing. She should have allowed herself to be a little crazier. Her parents would still have loved her, but afraid of hurting them, she had not dared to pay the price of her dream. That dream was now buried in the depths of her memory, although sometimes if it was awoken by a concert or by a beautiful record she happened to hear. Whenever that happened, though, the feelings of frustration were so intense that she immediately sent it back to sleep again. Veronica had known since childhood that her true vocation was to be a pianist. This was something she had felt ever since her first lesson at 12. Her teacher had recognized her talent too and had encouraged her to become a professional. But whenever she had felt pleased about a competition she had just won and said to her mother that she intended to give up everything and dedicate herself to the piano, her mother would look at her fondly and say, "No one makes a living playing the piano, my love." But you were the one who wanted me to have lessons, to develop your artistic gifts, that's all. A husband likes that kind of thing in a wife. He can show you off at parties. Forget about being a pianist and go and study law. That's the profession of the future. Veronica did as her mother asked. Sure that her mother had enough experience of life to understand reality. She finished her studies, went to university, got a good degree, but ended up working as a librarian. I should have been crazier. But as it undoubtedly happens with most people, she had found this out too late. She was about to continue on her way when someone took her by the arm. The powerful sedative was still flowing in her veins. That's why she didn't react when Edward, the schizophrenic, delicately began to lead her in a different direction towards the living room. The moon was still new, and Veronica had already sat down at the piano in response to Edward's silent request when she heard a voice coming from the refectory, someone speaking with a foreign accent. Veronica could not remember having heard it in Villette before. "I don't want to play the piano just now, Edward. I want to know what's going on in the world, what they're talking about over there, who that man is." Edward smiled, perhaps not understanding a word she was saying, but remembered what Dr. Igor had said. Schizophrenics could move in and out of their separate realities. "I'm going to die," she went on, hoping that her words were making sense to him. "Today death brushed my face with its wings and will probably be knocking at my door, if not tomorrow, then soon afterwards. It's not a good idea for you to get used to listening to the piano every night." "No one should let themselves get used to anything, Edward. Look at me. I was beginning to enjoy the sun again, the mountains, even life's problems. I was beginning to accept that the meaninglessness of life was no one's fault but mine. I wanted to see the main square in Jublajana again, to feel hatred and love, despair and tedium, all those simple, foolish things that make up everyday life but that give pleasure to your existence. If one day I could get out of here, I would allow myself to be crazy. Everyone is indeed crazy, but the craziest are the ones who don't know they are crazy. They just keep repeating what others tells them to." But none of that is possible, do you see? In the same way, you can't spend the whole day waiting for night to come, or for one of the patients to play the piano because soon that will end. My world and yours are about to come to an end. She got up, tenderly touched the boy's face, and then went to the refectory. When she opened the door, she came upon an unusual scene. The tables and the chairs had been pushed back against the walls, forming a large central space. There, sitting on the floor, were the members of the fraternity listening to a man in a suit and tie. Then they invited Nasruddin, the great master of the Sufi tradition, to give a lecture. He was saying, when the door opened, everyone in the room looked at Veronica. The man in the suit turned to her. Sit down. She sat down on the floor next to Marie, the white haired woman who had been so aggressive on their first encounter. To Veronica's surprise, Marie gave her a welcoming smile. The man in the suit went on. Nasruddin arranged to give a lecture at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and it looked set to be a great success. The 1,000 seats were completely sold out, and more than 700 people were left outside, watching the lecture on closed circuit television. At 2 o'clock precisely, an assistant of Nasruddin's came in, saying that for unavoidable reasons the lecture would begin late. Some got up indignantly, asked for their money back, and left. Even so, a lot of people remained both inside and outside the lecture hall. By 4 in the afternoon, the Sufi master had still not appeared, and people gradually began to leave the place. Picking up their money at the box office, the working day was coming to an end. It was time to go home. By 6 o'clock, the original 1,700 spectators had dwindled to less than 100. At that moment, Nasruddin came in. He appeared to be extremely drunk and began to flirt with a beautiful young woman sitting in the front row. Astonished, the people who had remained began to feel indignant. How could the man behave like that after making them wait for 4 solid hours? There were some disapproving murmurs, but the Sufi master ignored them. He went on in a loud voice to say how sexy the young woman was and invited her to go with him to France. Some teacher, thought Veronica. Just as well I've never believed in such things. After cursing the people who were complaining, Nasruddin tried to get up but fell heavily to the floor. Disgusted, more people decided to leave, saying it was pure charlatanism, that they would denounce the degrading spectacle to the press. Only 9 people remained. As soon as the final group of outraged spectators had left, Nasruddin got up. He was completely sober, his eyes glowed, and he had about him an air of great authority and wisdom. Those of you who stayed are the ones who will hear me, he said. You have passed through the 2 hardest tests on the spiritual road, the patience to wait for the right moment, and the courage not to be disappointed with what you encounter. It is you I will teach. And Nasruddin shared with them some of the Sufi techniques. The man paused and took a strange flute out of his pocket. Let's take a short break now, and then we'll do our meditation. The members of the group stood up. Veronica didn't know what to do. You get up too, said Marie, grabbing her hand. We have got a 5 minute break. I leave, I don't want to be in the way. Marie led her to one corner. Haven't you learned anything, not even with the approach of death? Stop thinking all the time that you are in the way, that you are bothering the person next to you. If people don't like it, they can complain. And if they don't have the courage to complain, that's their problem. That day, when I came over to you, I was doing something I had never dared to do before. And you allowed yourself to be cowed by a joke made by a lunatic. Why didn't you just stick to your guns? Why did you have to lose my dignity by being where I wasn't welcome? What's dignity? It's wanting everyone to think you are good, well behaved, full of love for your fellow men. Have some respect for nature. Watch a few films about animals and see how they fight for their own space. We all heartily approved of that slap of yours. Veronica did not have any more time to spend fighting for space, and so she changed the subject and asked who the man in the suit was. You are improving, Marie laughed. You now ask questions without worrying about whether you are being indiscreet or not. He's a Sufi master. What does Sufi mean? Wool. Veronica didn't understand. Wool? Sufism is the spiritual tradition of the dervishes. Its teachers never strive to show how wise they are, and their disciples go into a trance by performing a kind of whirling dance. What's the point of that? I'm not quite sure, but our group has resolved to investigate all prohibited experiences. All my life, the government taught us that the only purpose of searching for a spiritual meaning to life was to make people forget about their real problems. Now tell me this, wouldn't you say that trying to understand life was a real problem? Yes, it was, although Veronica wasn't sure anymore what the word real meant. The man in the suit, a Sufi master, according to Mari, asked them all to sit in a circle. From a vase, he removed all the flowers but one, a single red rose, and this he placed in the center of the group. You see how far we have come? Said Veronica to Mari. Some madmen decided it was possible to grow flowers in winters, and nowadays, throughout Europe, we have roses all year round. Do you think even a Sufi master with all his knowledge could do that? Mari seemed to guess her thoughts. Save your criticisms for later. I'll try to, although all I have is the present, and a very brief one too, it seems. That's all anyone has, and it's always very brief, although, of course, some people believe they have a past where they can accumulate things and a future where they will accumulate still more. By the way, speaking of the present moment, do you masturbate a lot? Although still under the effect of the sedative she had been given, Veronica was immediately reminded of the first words she had heard in Villette. When I was first brought here and was still full of tubes from the artificial respirator, I clearly heard someone asking me if I wanted to be masturbated. What is all that about? Why do you people spend your time thinking about such things? It's the same outside. It's just that here we don't need to hide the fact. Was it you who asked me? No, but I think that as far as pleasure is concerned, you do need to discover how far you can go. Next time, with a little patience, you might be able to take your partner there too, instead of wanting to be waiting to be guided by him. Even if you have only 2 days to live, I don't think you should leave this life without knowing how far you can go. Only if my partner is the schizophrenic who's right now waiting to hear me play the piano again. He's certainly nice looking. The man in the suit interrupted their conversation with a call for silence. He told everyone to concentrate on the rose and to empty their minds. The thoughts will come back, but try to push them to one side. You have two choices, to control your mind or to let your mind control you. You're already familiar with the latter experience, allowing yourself to be swept along by fears, neurosis, insecurity, for we all have self destructive tendencies. Don't confuse insanity with a loss of control. Remember that in the Sufi tradition, the master Nasruddin is the one everyone calls the madman. And it is precisely because his fellow citizens consider him insane that Nasruddin can say whatever he thinks and do whatever he wants. So it was with court gestures in the Middle Ages. They could alert the king to dangers that the ministers would not dare to comment on because they were afraid of losing their positions. That's how it should be with you. Stay insane, but behave like normal people. Run the risk of being different, but learn to do so without attracting attention. Concentrate on this flower and allow the real I to reveal itself. What is the real I? Asked Veronica. Perhaps everyone else there knew, but what did it matter? She must learn to care less about annoying others. The man seemed surprised by the interruption, but he answered her question. It's what you are. Now, no, not what you others make of you. Veronica decided to do the exercise, concentrating as hard as she could on discovering who she was. During those days in Villette, she had felt things she had never felt before with such intensity. Hatred, love, fear, curiosity, a desire to live. Perhaps Mari was right. Did she really know what it meant to have an orgasm? Or had she only gone as far as men had wanted to take her? The man started playing the flute. Gradually, the music calmed her soul, and she managed to concentrate on the rose. It might have been the effect of the sedative, but the fact was that since she had left Dr. Igor's consulting room, she had felt extremely well. She knew she was going to die soon. Why be afraid? It wouldn't help at all. It wouldn't prevent the fatal heart attack. The best plan would be to enjoy the days and hours that remained, doing things she never had done before. The music was soft, and the dim light in the refectory created an almost religious atmosphere. Religion. Why didn't she try going deep inside herself and see what remained of her beliefs and her faith? The music, however, was leading her elsewhere. Empty your mind. Stop thinking about anything. Simply be. Veronica gave herself up to the experience. She stared at the rose, saw who she was, liked what she saw, and felt only regret that she had been so hasty. When the meditation was over and the Sufi master had left, Mari stayed on for a while in the refectory, talking to the other members of the fraternity. Veronica said she was tired and left at once. After all, the sedative had been given that morning had been strong enough to knock out a horse. Yet she had still yet she had still had strength enough to remain awake all the time. That's youth for you. It sets its own limit without even asking if the body can take it, yet the body always does. Mari wasn't tired, she had slept late, then decided to go for a walk in Jublajana. Dr. Igor required the members of the fraternity to leave Villette every day. She had gone to the movies and fallen asleep again in her seat, watching a profoundly boring film about marital conflict. Was there no other subject? Why always repeat the same stories? Husband with lover, husband with wife and sick child, husband with wife, lover, and sick child. There were more important things in the world to talk about. The conversation in the refectory did not last long. The meditation had left the group members feeling relaxed and they were all ready to go back to their wards, except Mari, who instead went out to the garden. On the way, she passed the living room and saw that the young woman had not yet managed to get to bed. She was playing for Edward the schizophrenic, who had perhaps been waiting all that time by the piano. Like children, the insane will not budge until their desires have been satisfied. The air was icy. Mari came back in, grabbed a coat, and went out again. Outside, far from everyone's eyes, she lit a cigarette. She smoked slowly and guiltlessly, thinking about the young woman, the piano music she could hear, and life outside the walls of Villette, which was becoming unbearably difficult for everyone. In Mari's view, this difficulty was due not to chaos or disorganization or anarchy, but to excess of order. Society had more and more rules, and laws that contradicted the rules, and new rules that contradicted the laws. People felt too frightened to take even a step outside the invisible regulations that guided everyone's lives. Marie knew what she was talking about until her illness had brought her to Villette. She had spent 40 years of her life working as a lawyer. She had lost her innocent vision of justice early in her career, and had come to understand that the laws had not been created to resolve problems but in order to prolong quarrels indefinitely. It was a shame that Allah, Jehovah, God, it didn't matter what name you gave him, did not live in the world today. Because if he did, we would still be in paradise, while he would be mired in appeals, requests, demands, injunction, preliminary verdicts, and would have to justify to innumerable tribunals his decision to expel Adam and Eve from paradise for breaking an arbitrary rule with no foundation in law. Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat. If he had not wanted that to happen, why did he put the tree in the middle of the garden and not outside the walls of paradise? If she were called upon to defend the couple, Mary would undoubtedly accuse God of administrative negligence because, in addition to planting the tree in the wrong place, he had failed to surround it with warnings and barriers, had failed to adopt even minimal security arrangements, and had thus exposed everyone to danger. Mary could also accuse him of inducement to criminal activity, for he had pointed out to Adam and Eve the exact place where the tree was to be found. If he had said nothing, generations upon generation would have passed on this earth without anyone taking the slightest interest in the forbidden fruit, since the tree was presumably in the forest full of similar trees and therefore of no particular value. But God had proceeded quite differently. He had devised a rule and then found a way of persuading someone to break it, merely in order to invent punishment. He knew that Adam and Eve would become bored with perfection and would sooner or later test his patience. He set a trap, perhaps because he, Almighty God, was also bored with everything going so smoothly. If Eve had not eaten the apple, nothing of any interest would have happened in the last few billion years. When the law was broken, God, the omnipotent judge, even pretended to pursue them, as if he did not already know every possible hiding place. With the angels looking on, amused by the game, life must have been very dreary for them since Lucifer left heaven. He began to walk about the garden. Mary thought what a wonderful scene in a suspense movie that episode from the Bible would make. God's footsteps, the couple exchanging frightened glances, the feet suddenly stopping in their hiding place. "Where art thou?" asked God. "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." Adam replied, without knowing that by making that statement he had confessed himself guilty of a crime. So, by means of a simple trick, pretending not to know where Adam was or why he had run away, God got what he wanted. Even so, in order to leave no doubts among the audience of angels who were intently watching the episode, he decided to go further. Who told thee that thou was naked? Said God, knowing that this question could have only one possible response, because I ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. With that question, God demonstrated to his angels that he was a just God and that his condemnation of the couple was based on solid evidence. From then on, it wasn't a matter of whether it was woman's fault or of their asking for forgiveness. God needed an example so that no other being, earthly or heavenly, would ever again dare to go against his decisions. God expelled the couple and their children paid for the crime too, as still happens with the children of criminals, and thus the judiciary system was invented. The law, the transgression of the law, no matter how illogical or absurd, judgment in which the more experienced triumphs over the ingenuous, and punishment. Since all humanity was condemned with no right of appeal, humankind decided to create a defense mechanism against the eventuality of God deciding to wield his arbitrary power again. However, millennia of study resulted in so many legal measures that ultimately we went too far and justice became a tangle of clauses, ju- jurisprudence, and contradictory texts that no one could quite understand. So much so that when God had a change of heart and sent his son to save the world, what happened? He fell into the hands of the very justice he had invented. The tangle of laws created such confusion that the son ended up nailed to a cross. It was no simple trial. He was passed from Ananias to Caiaphas, from the priest to Pilate, who alleged that there was insufficient laws in the Roman code, from Pilate to Herod, who in turn alleged that the Jewish code did not permit the death sentence, from Herod back to Pilate again, who, looking for a way out, offered the people a judicial deal. He had the son beaten and then displayed to the people with his wounds, but it didn't work. Like prosecutors nowadays, Pilate decided to save himself at the expense of the condemned man. He offered to exchange Jesus for Barabbas, knowing that by then justice had become a grand spectacle requiring a denouncement, the death of the prisoner. Finally, Pilate used the article of law that gave the judge and not the person being judged the benefit of the doubt. He washed his hands, which means I'm not quite sure either way. It was just another ruse to preserve the Roman judicial system without injuring relations with local magistrate, and even transferring the weight of the decision onto the people, just in case the sentence should cause any problems and some inspectors from the imperial capital came to see for himself what was going on. Justice, law, although both were vital in order to protect the innocent, they did not always work to everyone's liking. Mary was glad to be far from all that confusion, although tonight, listening to the piano, she was not quite so sure that Villette was the right place for her. If I were to decide once and for all to leave here, I wouldn't go back to the law. I'm not going to spend my life with crazy people who think they are normal and important, but whose sole function in life is to make everything more difficult for others. I'll be a seamstress, an embroiderer. I'll sell fruit outside the municipal theatre. I've always made my contribution to the futile insanity of the law. In Villette, you were allowed to smoke, but not to stub your cigarette out on the lawn. With great pleasure, she did what was forbidden, because the great advantage of being there was not having to respect the rules and not even having to put up with any major consequences if you broke them. She went over to the front gate. The guard, there was always a guard there after all, that was the law, nodded to her and opened the gate. I'm not going out, she said. Lovely piano music, said the guard. I've listened to it nearly every night. It won't last much longer, she said, and walked rapidly away so as not to have to explain. Marie remembered what she had read in the young girl's eyes at the moment she had come into the refectory. Fear. Fear. Veronica might feel insecurity, shyness, shame, constraint, but why fear? That was only justifiable when confronted by a real threat. Ferocious animals, armed attackers, earthquakes, but not a group of people gathered together in a refectory. But human beings are like that, she thought. We have replaced nearly all our emotions with fear. And Marie knew what she was talking about, because that was what had brought her to Villette. Panic attacks. In her room, Mari had a veritable library of articles on the subject. Now people talked about it openly, and she had recently seen a German television program in which people discussed their experiences. In that same program, a survey revealed that a significant percentage of the population suffers from panic attacks, although most of those affected tried to hide the symptoms for fear of being considered insane. But at the time when Mari had her first attack, none of this was known. It was absolute hell, she thought, lighting another cigarette. The piano was still playing. The girl seemed to have enough energy to play all night. A lot of the inmates had been affected by the young woman's arrival in the hospital, Mari among them. At first, she had tried to avoid her, afraid to awaken the young woman's desire to live. Since there was no escape, it was better that she should keep on wanting to die. Dr. Igor had let it be known that even though she would continue to be given daily injections, her physical conditions would visibly deteriorate and there would be no way of saving her. The inmates had understood the message and kept their distance from the condemned woman. However, without anyone knowing quite why, Veronica had begun fighting for her life. And the only two people who approached her were Zetka, who would be leaving tomorrow and didn't talk that much anyway, and Edward. Mari needed to have a word with Edward. He always respected her opinions. Did he not realize he was drawing Veronica back into the world and that was the worst thing he could do to someone with no hope of salvation? She considered 1,000 ways of explaining the situation to him, but all of them would only make him feel guilty, and that she would never do. Mari thought a little and decided to let things run their normal course. She was no longer a lawyer and she did not want to set a bad example by creating new laws of behavior in a place where anarchy should reign. But the presence of the young woman had touched a lot of people there, and some were ready to rethink their lives. At one of the meetings with the fraternity, someone had tried to explain what was happening. Deaths in Villette tended to happen suddenly without giving anyone time to think about it, or after a long illness when death is always a blessing. The young woman's case, though, was dramatic because she was so young and because she now wanted to live again, something they all knew to be possible. Some people asked themselves, what if that happened to me? I do have a chance to live. Am I making good use of it? Some were not bothered with finding an answer. They had long ago given up and now formed part of the world in which neither life nor death, space, or time existed. Others, however, were being forced to think hard, and Mari was one of them. Veronica stopped playing for a moment and looked out at Mari in the garden. She was wearing only a light jacket against the cold night air. Did she want to die? No, I was the one who wanted to die. She turned back to the piano. In the last days of her life, she had finally realized her grand dream to play with heart and soul for as long as she wanted, and whenever the mood took her, it didn't matter to her that her only audience was a young schizophrenic. He seemed to understand the music, and that was what mattered. Mari had never wanted to kill herself. On the contrary, 5 years before, in the same movie theater she had visited today, she had watched, horrified, a film about poverty in El Salvador and thought how important her life was. At that time, with her children grown up and making their way in their own professions, she had decided to give up the tedious, unending job of being a lawyer in order to dedicate the rest of her days to working for some humanitarian organization. The rumors of civil war in the country were growing all the time, but Mari didn't believe them. It was impossible that at the end of the 20th century, the European community would allow a new war at its gates. On the other side of the world, however, there was no shortage of tragedies, and one of those tragedies was El Salvador's, where starving children were forced to live on the streets and turn to prostitution. It's terrible, she said to her husband, who was sitting in the seat next to her. He nodded. Mari had been putting off the decision for a long time, but perhaps now was the moment to talk to him. They had been given all the good things that life could possibly offer them: a home, work, good children, modest comforts, interests, and culture. Why not do something for others for a change? Mari had contacts in the Red Cross and she knew that volunteers were desperately needed in many parts of the world. She was tired of struggling with bureaucracy and lawsuits, unable to help people who had spent years of their lives trying to resolve problems not of their own making. Working with the Red Cross, though, she would see immediate results. She decided that when they left the movie theater, she would invite her husband for a coffee so that they could discuss the idea. Just as a Salvadoran government official appeared on screen to offer a bold excuse for some new injustice, Mari suddenly noticed her heart beating faster. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps the stuffy atmosphere in the movie was getting to her. If the symptoms persisted, she would go out to the foyer to get a breath of fresh air. But events took on their own momentum. Her heart began beating faster and faster, and she broke out in a cold sweat. She felt afraid and tired, tried hard to concentrate on the film in an attempt to display any negative thoughts, but realized she could no longer follow what was happening on the screen. Mari could see the images and subtitles, but she seemed to have entered a completely different reality, where everything going on around her seemed strange and out of kilter, as if taking place in a world she did not know. I don't feel well, she said to her husband. She had put off making that remark as long as possible because it meant admitting that there was something wrong, but she could not hold out any longer. Let's go outside, he said. When he took his wife's hand to help her to her feet, he noticed it was ice cold. I don't think I can get that far. Please tell me what's happening to me. Her husband felt afraid too. Sweat was pouring down Mari's face, and there was a strange light in her eyes. Keep calm. I'll go out and call a doctor. She was gripped by despair. What he said made absolute sense, but everything, the theater, the semi darkness, the people sitting side by side staring up at the brilliant screen, all of it seemed so threatening. She was certain she was alive. She could even touch the life around her as if it were something solid, and that had never happened to her before. On no account, leave me here alone. I'll get up and go out with you, but take it slowly. They both made their apologies to the people in the same row and began walking to the exit at the back of the cinema. Mari's heart was now beating furiously, and she was certain, absolutely certain, that she would never get out of that place. Everything she did, every gesture she made, placing one foot in front of the other, saying excuse me, holding on to her husband's arm, breathing in and out, seemed terrifyingly conscious and deliberate. She had never felt so frightened in her life. I'm going to die right here in this movie theater. And she was convinced that she knew what was happening because many years before a friend of hers had died in a movie theater of a cerebral aneurysm. Cerebral aneurysms are like time bombs. They are tiny varicose veins that form along the arteries, like the ballooning you get on worn tires, and they can remain there undetected during a whole lifetime. No one knows they have got an aneurysm unless it's discovered accidentally, for example, after a brain scan carried out for other reasons, or at the moment when it actually ruptures, flooding everything with blood, leaving the person in an immediate state of coma, usually followed by death. While she was walking down the aisle of the dark theatre, Mary remembered the friend she had lost. The strangest thing, though, was the effect this ruptured aneurysm was having on her perception. She seemed to have been transported to a different planet, seeing each familiar thing as if for the first time. And then there was the terrifying, inexplicable fear, the sheer panic of being alone on that other planet. Death. I must stop thinking. I'll pretend that everything is all right and then everything will be. She tried to act naturally, and for a few seconds the sense of oddness diminished. The 2 minutes that elapsed between first feeling the palpitation and reaching the exit with her husband were the most terrifying 2 minutes of her life. When they reached the brightly lighted foyer, everything seemed to start up again. The colors were so garish, the noises from the streets seemed to rush in on her from all the sides, and everything seemed utterly unreal. She started to notice certain details for the first time, for example, the clarity of vision that covers only the small area on which we fix our gaze, while the rest remains completely unfocused. There was more. She knew that everything she could see around her was just a scene created by electrical impulses inside her brain, using light impulses that pass through a gelatinous organ called the eye. No, she must stop thinking. That's how she could be brought to insanity. By then, her fear of an aneurysm had passed. She had managed to get out of the theater and was still alive. The friend who had died, on the other hand, never had the time to leave her seat. I'll call an ambulance, said her husband, when he saw his wife's ashen face and bloodless lips. Call a taxi, she said, hearing the sounds leaving her mouth, conscious of the vibration of each vocal cord. Going to a hospital would mean accepting that she really was seriously ill, and Mari was determined to do her utmost to restore everything to normality. They left the foyer, and icy cold air seemed to have a positive effect. Mari recovered some control over herself, although the inexplicable feelings of panic and terror persisted. While her husband was desperately trying to find a taxi, which were scarce at the time of the day. She sat down on the curb and tried not to look at her surroundings. The children playing, the buses passing, the music coming from a nearby street fair, all seemed absolutely surreal, frightening, alien. Finally, a taxi appeared. To the hospital, her husband said, helping his wife in. Please, let's just go home, she said. She didn't want to be in any more strange places. She was desperately in need of familiar, ordinary things that might diminish the fear that she was feeling. While the taxi was driving them home, her heart rate gradually slowed and her temperature began to return to normal. I'm beginning to feel better, she said to her husband. It must have been something I ate. When they reached their house, the world again seemed exactly as it had been since her childhood. When she saw her husband go over to the phone, she asked him what he was doing. I'm going to call a doctor. There's no need. Look at me. I'm fine. The color had returned to her cheeks, her heart was beating normally, and the uncontrollable fear had vanished. Marie slept heavily that night and awoke convinced that someone must have put some drug in the coffee they had drunk before they went into the theater. It was a dangerous prank, and she was fully prepared at the end of the afternoon to call the prosecutor and go to the bar to try and find the person responsible. She went to work, read through several pending lawsuits, and tried to occupy herself with various other tasks, for the experience of the previous day had left a residue of fear, and she wanted to prove to herself that it would never happen again. She discussed the film on El Salvador with one of her colleagues and mentioned it passing that she was fed up with doing the same thing every day. Perhaps it's time I retired. You're one of the best lawyers we have got, said the colleague. Besides, law is one of the few professions where age is in your favor. Why not take a long vacation instead? I'm sure you would come back to work with renewed energy. I want to do something completely different with my life. I want to have an adventure, help other people, do something I've never done before. The conversation ended there. She went down to the square, had lunch in a more expensive restaurant than the one she normally went to, and returned to the office early. That moment marked the beginning of her withdrawal. The rest of the employees had still not come back, and Marie took the opportunity to look over the work still on her desk. She opened the drawer to take out the pencil she always kept in the same place, and she couldn't find it. For a fraction of a second, it occurred to her that her failure to put the pencil back in its proper place was an indication that she was perhaps behaving oddly. That was enough to make her heart start pounding again, and the terror of the previous night returned in full force. Marie was frozen to the spot. The sun was coming in through the shutters, lending a brighter, more aggressive tone to everything around her, but she again had the feeling that she was about to die at any minute. It was all so strange. What was she doing in that office? I don't believe in you, God, but please help me. Again, she broke out in a cold sweat and realized that she was unable to control her fear. If someone came in at that moment, they would notice her frightened eyes and she would be lost. Cold air. The cold air had made her feel better the previous night, but how could she get as far as the street? Once more, she was noticing each detail of what was happening to her. Her breathing rate. There were moments when she felt that if she did not make a special effort to inhale and exhale, her body would be incapable of doing so itself. The movement of her head. The images succeeded one another as if there were television cameras whirring inside it. Her heart beating faster and faster, her body bathed in a cold, sticky sweat. And then the terror, an awful, inexplicable fear of doing anything, of taking a single step, of leaving the chair she was sitting in. It will pass. It had passed last time, but now she was at work. What could she do? She looked at the clock, and it seemed to her an absurd mechanism, two needles turning on the same axis, indicating a measurement of time that no one had ever explained. Why 12 and not 10, like all our other measurements? I must not think about these things. They make me crazy. Crazy. Perhaps that was the right word to describe what was going wrong with her. Summoning all her willpower, she got to her feet and made her way to the toilets. Fortunately, the office was still empty, and in a minute that seemed to last an eternity, and she managed to reach them. She splashed her face with water, and the feeling of strangeness diminished, although the fear remained. It will pass, she said to herself. Yesterday it did. She remembered that the day before the whole thing had lasted about 30 minutes. She locked herself in one of the toilets, sat on the toilet seat, and put her head between her knees. That position, however, seemed only to amplify the sound of her heart beating, and Marie immediately sat up again. It will pass. She stayed there, thinking that she no longer knew who she was, that she was hopelessly lost. She heard the sound of people coming in and out of the toilets and faucets being turned on and off, pointless conversations about banal subjects. More than once, someone tried to open the door of the cubicle where she was sitting, but she had something in the murmur and no one insisted. The noise of toilet flushing was like some horrendous force of nature capable of demolishing an entire building and sweeping everyone down into hell. But as she had foreseen, the fear passed and her heartbeat returned to normal. It was just as well that her secretary was incompetent, even though enough not even to notice her absence, otherwise, the whole office would have been in the toilets asking if she was all right. When she knew that she had regained control of herself, Mary opened the cubicle door, again splashed her face with water for a long time, and went back to the office. You haven't got any makeup on, said a trainee. Do you want to borrow some of mine? Mary didn't even bother to reply. She went into the office, picked up her handbag and her personal belongings, and told her secretary that she would be spending the rest of the day at home. But you have got lots of appointments, protested her secretary. You don't give orders, you receive them. Do exactly as I say and cancel the appointments. The secretary stared at this woman with whom she had been working for nearly 3 years and who had never once been rude to her before. Something must be seriously wrong with her. Perhaps someone had told her that her husband was at home with his lover and she wanted to catch them in flagrance. She's a good lawyer, she knows what she is doing, said the girl to herself. Doubtless tomorrow she would come and apologize to her. There was no tomorrow. The night Mary had a long conversation with her husband and described all the symptoms she had experienced. Together they reached the conclusion that the palpitations, the cold sweats, the feelings of displacement, impotence, lack of control could be all summed up in one word: fear. Together, husband and wife pondered what was happening. He thought it might be a brain tumor, but he didn't say anything. She thought she was having premonitions of some terrible event, but she didn't say anything either. They tried to find some common ground for discussion, like logical, reasonable, mature people. Perhaps you would better have some tests done. Mary agreed, on one condition: that no one, not even their children, should know anything about it. The next day she applied for and was given 30 days unpaid leave from the office. Her husband thought of taking her to Austria, where there were many eminent specialists in disorders of the brain, but she refused to leave the house. The attacks were becoming more frequent and lasted longer. With Mari dosed up on tranquilizers, the two of them managed with great difficulty to get as far as a hospital in Jublajana, where Mari underwent a vast range of tests. Nothing unusual was found, not even an aneurysm, a source of consolation to Mari for the rest of her life, but the panic attacks continued. While her husband did the shopping and the cooking, Mari obsessively cleaned the house every day just to keep her mind fixed on other things. She started reading all the psychiatry books she could find, only immediately to put them down again because she seemed to recognize her own malice in each of the illnesses they described. The worst of it was, although the attacks were no longer a novelty, she still felt the same intense fear and sense of alienation from reality, the same loss of self control. In addition, she started to feel guilty about her husband, obliged to do his own job as well as all the household work, cleaning apart. As times passed and the situation remained unsolved, Mari began to feel and express a deep irritation. The slightest thing made her lose her temper and start shouting, then sob hysterically. After her 30 days leave was over, one of Mari's colleagues turned up at the house. He had phoned every day, but Mari either didn't answer the phone or else asked her husband to say she was busy. That afternoon, he simply stood there ringing the bell until she opened the front door. Mari had had a quiet morning. She made some tea, and they talked about the office, and he asked her when she would be coming back to work. Never. He remembered their conversation about El Salvador. You have always worked hard and you have the right to choose what you want to do, he said, with no rancor in his voice. But I think that in cases such as these, work is the best therapy. Do some traveling, see the world, go wherever you think you might be useful, but the doors of the office are always open, awaiting your return. When she heard this, Mari burst into tears, which she often did now with great ease. Her colleague waited for her to calm down. Like a good lawyer, he didn't ask anything. He knew he had a greater chance of getting a reply to his silence than to any question. And so it was. Mari had told him the whole story, from what had happened in the movie theater to her recent hysterical attacks on her husband, who had given her so much support. I'm crazy, she said. Possibly, he replied with an all-knowing air but with real tenderness in his voice. In that case, you have two options. Either get some treatment or continue being ill. There isn't any treatment for what I'm feeling. I'm still in full possession of my mental faculties, and I'm worried because this situation has gone on now for such a long time. I don't have any of the classic symptoms of insanity like withdrawal from reality, apathy, or uncontrolled aggression, just fear. That's what all crazy people say, that they are perfectly normal. The two of them laughed and she made more tea. They talked about the weather, the success of Slovenian independence, the growing tension between Croatia and Yugoslavia. Mari watched TV all day and was very well informed. Before saying goodbye, her colleague touched on the subject again. They have just opened a new hospital in the city, he said, backed by foreign money and offering first class treatment. Treatment for what? Imbalances, shall we say? An excessive fear is definitely an imbalance. Mari promised to think about it, but she still took no real decision. She continued to have panic attacks for another month until she realized that not only her personal life but her marriage was on the point of collapse. Again, she asked for some tranquilizers, and again, she managed to set foot outside the house for only the second time in 6 days. In 60 days. She took a taxi and went to the new hospital. On the way, the driver asked if she was going to visit someone. They say it's very comfortable, but apparently they have got some real nutters in there too. And part of the treatment includes electric shocks. I'm going to visit someone, said Mari. It took only an hour of conversation for Mari's 2 months of suffering to come to an end. The director of the hospital, a tall man with dyed hairs, who answered to the name of Dr. Igor, explained that it was merely a panic disorder, a recently recognized illness in the annals of world psychiatry. That doesn't mean it's a new illness, he explained, taking care to make himself clear. What happens in that is that the people affected by it tends to hide, afraid they will be mistaken for lunatics. It's just a chemical imbalance in the body, as in depression. Dr. Igor wrote her a prescription and told her to go back to home. I don't want to go back now, said Mari. Even after all you have told me, I won't have the courage to go out onto the street. My marriage has become a hell, and my husband needs time to recover from these months he has spent looking after me. As always happened in such cases, because the shareholders wanted to keep the hospital working at full capacity, Dr. Igor accepted her as a patient, although making it absolutely clear that it wasn't necessary. Mari received the necessary medications along with the appropriate psychiatric treatment, and the symptoms diminished and finally disappeared altogether. During that time, however, the story of her internment in the hospital went the rounds of the small city of Jublajana. Her colleague, the same friend who had a cup of tea with her only weeks ago, the companion who shared with her God knows how many moments of joy and trepidation, came to visit her invalid. He complimented her on her courage in following his advice and getting help, but he then went on to explain the real reason for his visit. Perhaps it really is time you retire. Marie knew what lay behind those words. No one was going to entrust their affairs to a lawyer who had been a mental patient. You said that work was the best therapy. I need to come back, even if only for a short time. She waited for a response, but he said nothing. Mari went on. You were the one who suggested I get treatment. When I was considering retirement, my idea was to leave on a high note, fulfilled, having made a free, spontaneous decision. I don't want to leave my job just like that, defeated. At least give me a chance to win back my self-esteem, and I'll ask to retire. The lawyer cleared his throat. I suggested you get treatment. I didn't say anything about going into a hospital. But it wasn't a question of survival. I was too afraid to go out into the street. My marriage was falling apart. Mari knew she was wasting her words. Nothing she could say would persuade him. After all, it was the prestige of the office that was at risk. Even so, she tried once more. Inside here, I've lived with two sorts of people. Those who have no chance of ever going back into society, and those who are completely cured, but who prefers to pretend to be mad rather than face up to life's real responsibilities. I want and need to learn to like myself again. I have to convince myself that I am capable of taking my own decisions. I can't be pushed into decisions not of my own making. We are allowed to make a lot of mistakes in our lives, said her colleague, except the mistake that destroys us. There was no point in continuing the conversation. In his opinion, Mari had committed the fatal error. 2 days later, she received a visit from another lawyer, this time from a different practice, her now ex-colleague's greatest rival. Mari cheered up. Perhaps he knew she was free to take up a new post, and there was a chance she could regain her place in the world. The lawyer came into the visiting room, sat down opposite her, smiled, asked if she was feeling better, and then took various papers out of his briefcase. I am here at your husband's request, he said. This is an application for divorce. Obviously, he will continue to pay all your hospital bills for as long as you remained in here. This time, Mari did not attempt to argue. She signed everything, even though she knew that, in accordance with the law she had studied and practiced, she could prolong the quarrel indefinitely. She then went straight to see Dr. Igor and told him that her symptoms had returned. Dr. Igor knew she was lying, but he nevertheless extended her internment for an indefinite period. Veronica decided she would have to go to bed, but Edward was still standing by the piano. I'm tired, Edward. I need to sleep. She would have liked to continue playing for him, dredging up from her anesthetized memory all the sonatas, requiems, and adagios she used to know, because he knew how to admire without appearing to demand anything of her. But her body could take no more. He was so good looking. If only he would take one step outside his world and see her as a woman, then her last night on this earth might be the most beautiful of her entire life. Edward was the only one capable of understanding that Veronica was an artist. Through the pure emotion of sonata or a minuet, she had forged a bond with this man such as had never known with anyone else. Edward was the ideal man, sensitive, educated, a man who had destroyed an indifferent world in order to recreate it again in his head. This time with new colors, new characters, new stories. And this new world included a woman, a piano, and a moon that was continuing to grow. I could fall in love right now and give everything I have to you, she said, knowing that he couldn't understand her. All you ask from me is a little music, but I'm much more than I ever thought I was, and I would like to share other things with you that I have only just begun to understand. Edward smiled. Had he understood? Veronica felt afraid. All the manuals of good behavior say that you should never speak of love so directly, and never to a man you barely know. But she decided to continue, because she had nothing to lose. You're the only man on the face of the earth with whom I could fall in love, Edward, for the simple reason that when I die, you will not miss me. I don't know what schizophrenics feel, but I'm sure they never miss anyone. Perhaps to begin with, you'll miss the fact that there's no more night music, but the moon will still rise. There will be someone willing to play sonatas for you, especially in a hospital where each and every one of us is a lunatic. She didn't quite know what the relationship was between lunatics and the moon, but must be a strong one. If they used a word like that to describe the insane. And I won't miss you either, Edward, because I will be dead, far from here. And since I'm not afraid of losing you, I don't care what you think or don't think about me. Tonight I played for you like a woman in love. It was wonderful. It was the best moment of my entire life. She looked at Mari outside in the garden. She remembered her words, and again she looked at the man standing in front of her. Veronica took off her sweater and moved closer to Edward. If she was going to do something, let it be now. Mari would put up with the cold out there for a long time, and only then would she come back in. He stepped back. The question in his eyes was this: when was she going to play the piano again? When would she play a new piece of music to fill his soul with the same color, pain, suffering, and joy of those insane composers who had leapt the generations with their work? The woman outside told me to masturbate and to find out how far I can go. Can I really go farther than I have ever been before? She took his hand and tried to pull him towards the sofa, but Edward politely declined. He preferred to remain standing where he was beside the piano, waiting patiently for her to play again. Veronica was disconcerted at first, and then realized that she had nothing to lose. She was dead. What was the point of continuing to feed the fears or preconceptions that had always limited her life? She took off her blouse, her trousers, her bra, her panties, and stood before him naked. Edward laughed. She didn't know why, she merely noted that he had laughed. Delicately, she took his hand and placed it on her genitals. His hand remained there, immobile. Veronica gave up the idea and removed his hand. Something was exciting her far more than any physical contact with this man. The fact that she could do whatever she wanted, that there were no limits apart from the woman outside who might come back in at any moment. Nobody else could be awake. Her blood began to race, and the cold, which she had felt when she took off her clothes, was fading. Veronica and Edward were both standing up face to face, she naked, he fully clothed. Veronica slid her own hand down to her genitals and started to masturbate. She had done it before, either alone or with certain partners, but never in a situation like this, where the man showed no apparent interest in what was happening. And this was exciting, very exciting. Standing up, legs apart, Veronica was touching her genitals, her breast, her hair, surrendering herself as she had never done before. Not because she wanted to see Edward leave his distant world, but because this was something she had never experienced before. She started talking, saying unthinkable things, things that her parents, her friends, her ancestors would have considered absolute filth. Her first orgasm came, and she bit her lips so as not to cry out with pleasure. Edward was looking at her. There was a different light in his eyes, as if he understood. Even if it was only the energy, heat, sweat, and smell that her body gave off, Veronica was still not satisfied. She knelt down and started masturbating again. She wanted to die of orgasmic pleasure, thinking about and realizing everything that had always been forbidden to her. She begged him to touch her, to force her, to use her in any way he wanted. She wished Zetka were there too, because a woman knows how to touch another woman's body better than any man, because she already knows all its secrets. On her knees before Edward, who remained standing, she felt possessed, touched, and she used coarse words to describe what she wanted him to do to her. Another orgasm came, stronger than ever, as if everything around her were about to explode. She remembered the heart attack she had had that morning, but what did that matter? She would die in one great explosion of pleasure. She was tempted to touch Edward. He was there before her, but she did not want to risk spoiling the moment. She was going far, very far, just as Mary had said. She imagined herself both queen and slave, dominatrix and victim. In her imagination, she was making love with men of all skin color, white, black, yellow, with homosexual and beggars. She was anyone's, and anyone could do anything to her. She had one, two, three orgasms, one after another. She imagined everything she had never imagined before, and she gave herself to all that was most base and most pure. At last, unable to contain herself any longer, she cried out with pleasure, with the pain of all those orgasms, all those men and women who had entered and left her body through the doors of her mind. She lay down on the ground and stayed there, drenched in sweat, her soul full of peace. She had concealed her hidden desires even from herself, unable to say why, but she needed no answer. It was enough that she had done what she had done. She had surrendered herself. Gradually, the universe returned to its proper place, and Veronica stood up. Edward had not moved in all that time, but there seemed to be something different about him. There was a tenderness in his eyes, a very human tenderness. It was so good that I can see love in everything, even in the eyes of a schizophrenic. She was beginning to put her clothes back on when she felt a third presence in the room. Mari was there. Veronica didn't know when she had come in or what she had heard or seen, but even so, she felt no shame or fear. She merely looked at her distantly, as one does at someone who has come too close. I did as you suggested, she said, and I went a long, long way. Mari said nothing. She had just been reliving certain vital moments of her past life, and she was feeling slightly uneasy. Perhaps it was time to return to the world, to face up to the things out there, to say that everyone could be a member of great fraternity, even if they had never been in a mental hospital. Like this young girl, for example, whose only reason for being in Villette was because she had made an attempt on her own life. She had never known panic, depression, mystical visions, psychosis, the limits to which the mind can take us. Although she had known many men, she had never experienced the most hidden part of her own desires, and the result was that half of her life had been unknown to her. If only everyone could know and live with their inner craziness, would the world be a worse place for it? No, people would be fairer and happier. Why did I never do that before? He wants you to play more music, said Mari, looking at Edward. I think he deserves it. I will, but answer my question first. Why did I never do that before? If I'm free, if I can think whatever I choose to think, why have I always avoided imagining forbidden situations? Forbidden? Listen, I was a lawyer and I know the law. I was also a Catholic and I used to know whole sections of the Bible by heart. What do you mean by forbidden? Mari went over to her and helped her on with her sweater. Look me in the eye and never forget what I'm about to tell you. There are only two options, two prohibitions, one according to man's law, other according to God. Never force a sexual relationship on anyone because that is considered to be rape. And never have sexual relations with children because that is the worst of all sins. Apart from that, you are free. There's always someone who wants exactly what you want. Mari didn't have the patience to teach important things to someone who was about to die. With a smile, she said good night and left the room. Edward didn't move. He was waiting for the music. Veronica needed to reward him for the immense pleasure he had given her, merely by staying with her and witnessing her insanity without horror or repulsion. She sat down at the piano and started to play again. Her soul was light, and not even the fear of death tormented her now. She had experienced what she had always kept hidden from herself. She had experienced the pleasures of virgin and prostitute, of slave and queen, albeit more slave than queen. That night, as if by a miracle, all the songs she had known returned to her memory, and she played in order to give Edward as much pleasure as she herself had experienced. That brings us to the end of this today's reading, page 136. We will continue from 137 tomorrow when we continue with the reading. Bye bye for now. If you have any comments, any suggestions, recommendations for future reading, any feedback, criticism, negative, positive, anything is welcome. You can reach out in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section. Bye bye. Keep reading. Take care. And if you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe.